My fear for the West is that they are going to make the exact same mistake that we made in South Africa and write restorative justice into law. It's blatantly obvious that the West is going down the exact same path as South Africa. They are just one generation behind it.
It's our turn now. They must be happy. We're not beating them up. They must be happy. We're not calling for genocide.
Shoot to kill. Yamaza. Kill the poor, the farmer.
My grandfather's brother, David de Villiers, was murdered on his farm when I was 17 years old. And his killer actually wrote in the blood on his walls, "White Devil."
We must see this process of accelerated land redistribution as an opportunity rather than as a threat.
The messaging that politicians use is to create envy in order to get votes.
For each one person that is being killed by the taxi industry, will kill 5 white people.
We have about 480,000 active employed private security guards, which is roughly about twice the size of the entire military and police force in South Africa.
The growth of the private security sector has seen an aggressive spike over the last 20 years, congruent to the rise in crime in South Africa.
This, in turn, creates a vicious cycle because it creates more and more and more envy amongst those who do not have, because the haves are improving their lives.
We're not talking about you, brothers and sisters. You are black like us and we are just victims.
Under those conditions, I would also be envious, and I would also be really angry. And the problem is that they do not direct their anger against the people who actually destroyed their lives. They direct it against white people, because the people who are actively destroying their livelihoods are continuously telling them it's the white man's fault.
The leader of Black Land First, BLF, Andile Mqidama, says whites still own everything in South Africa and blacks own nothing.
And this is also happening in Europe.
My name is Stefan Tompson and I'm the founder of Visagrad 24, and I'm here in South Africa in Pretoria with a good and old friend of mine, Willem Petzer, who's an Afrikaner rights activist. He's a YouTuber, he's an entrepreneur, and above all, he's a dear friend. We've been out here on the farmlands, traveling through South Africa. And in this conversation, I want to ask Willem about some of the issues that South Africa is facing and how those issues are relevant to us in the West. Willem, wonderful to have you here.
It's great to finally have a formal interview, Stefan.
This is going to be a very informal interview. Willem, tell me, let's just start with, to the people who are unfamiliar with your work. You're very famous in South Africa. Wherever we go, people recognize you, people walk up to you. Afrikaners, Boers walk up, they say thank you. What is it that you do?
So Stefan, we went to the White Cross Monument and you saw what a big problem farmers are. You posted the statistics there. You made the story about 95% of these murders that go unsolved. We all know that the police are incompetent. It's probably one of the most incompetent police forces in the world. And that is basically a symptom of a bigger problem that we have, which is the fact that not only are the police corrupt and incompetent, but also the farming communities, and not just the farming communities, all the communities in this country are trying to stand up for themselves, but they are actively being persecuted for it while the criminals run free. And that is the core of what I'm trying to do. You named the fact that I'm on YouTube and on social media making videos and so forth, but the core of what I really do with my organization is trying to help those that are being persecuted for defending themselves. For example, we had two young ladies who were the daughters of a farmer. This farmer is incapable of farming anymore because of health problems. So his daughters, who are in their late 20s, early 30s, had to take over. He doesn't have a son, and they farm with sheep. They found a group of thieves on their farm, and there was an altercation between them and the thieves. Shots were fired between them. These two young ladies were then 2 days later had a SWAT team arrive at their house. The door was kicked in. The police absolutely abused these two young girls, and they even threatened them that they are going to pull out their father's oxygen machine if they don't cooperate, and they were just putting their hands up and saying, sorry, we'll do it. And then after a long series of intimidation and abuse to these young ladies, they were then arrested. And they are currently being prosecuted for attempted murder, amongst other things. So for them, we did fundraisers to get them a good lawyer, their legal fees. On the other hand, we've done quite a few such cases. If I'm not mistaken, 7 such cases. Another one was a guy who had an attack on his farm, and then his dog bit one of the attackers. The attacker then went and made a case. Nobody asked him why he was there in the first place, but they are now being prosecuted for attempted murder as well, because they also run a security company, and it was a security dog that bit this attacker. And then, of course, there are some guys that actually got jail time for things that they did, especially at protests against us, because people do get angry, and they do sometimes do things that are illegal, but because of the cause that they fight for, they want this country to be fixed. And he was actually given a sentence of 8 months in jail, and we looked after his wife during that time, made sure that the income that they had when he was still working, because he was the sole provider, was on par with what we had given them. So basically that is the core of what I'm doing, and the videos on social media and so on are more just to raise awareness, but it's not the core of the work that I'm doing to help the people in this country.
So we went to the White Cross Memorial, the Witgrace Monument, where there is a cross planted for every single farmer that has been murdered since 1990, I believe, roughly.
Yes.
Tell me more about the general phenomena of farm attacks and farm murders.
Well, generally, if you look at the statistics, it's roughly 1 farm murder per week and 1 farm attack per day. And that's what's happening right here. And you can't really pinpoint exactly what the reason behind farm murders is. I mean, it's a very lawless country. We have 50 murders a day. Most of our murders, more than 90%, go unsolved. And when I say unsolved, I don't even mean the conviction rate. This is only the guys that get arrested, or 5%. Out of that 5%, not even half get convicted of everything. Sure. And within that 5%, also, they do not arrest all of the culprits. Like most farm attacks, we see about 6-7 attackers, then maybe 1 or 2 get arrested and prosecuted. And out of that one or two that get prosecuted, maybe 1 gets convicted. So the whole system is just broken around the farm murders, and that is the system that I try to do work within, especially to help the victims' families, and also to basically, if I can put it in a very simple sentence, tell them it's okay to defend yourself. If you get persecuted or prosecuted for defending yourself, we are here to help you and assist you. We will give you this legal aid. We will make sure to try and raise money that you can pay your legal fees to get the best possible representation, to get the best possible outcome for you. We know it's not right. We know the system is broken. It's failing our people, and the reason that you get prosecuted in the first place is wrong. But what we can do is we can assist you and help you with that.
There was a trend online a few years ago where a number of journalists came out and did documentaries about farm murders.
Yes.
There was, often it has been represented as, it's been hijacked in a certain sense by, one could even say, white supremacist groups who claim this is purely racial, that this is black on white crime. The farmers, commercial farmers, are mostly white. The attackers are mostly black. Is that true? How much nuance is there in this? What are some of the actual reasons, Willem, for the farmer? Like, if you could break down into, say, the core reasons for, that'd be great.
So it is a lot more nuanced than most of these documentaries make it out to be. Some of these attacks are just robberies gone wrong. Some of these attacks are even hits. Some of these attacks are racially motivated, and it would be completely impossible to give an exact number or an exact breakdown of which is which. Sure. But the point that there is racial motivation to this does have a lot of merit towards it, because we have our previous president, Jacob Zuma, singing Dubula Ibuna, which literally means kill the Boer. Then we have Malema, who's more of a younger, more, he's more popular at the universities. His party gets about 90% of all black university-educated votes.
He's the leader of the economic freedom.
The economic freedom fighters, yes, and he came out and he made it English because, in South Africa, amongst the young educated classes, it's more popular to speak English, whereas the older, let's say less educated guys still speak Zulu and these languages.
Sure.
So he translated it to English and he came up with the song Kill the Boer in English.
Shoot to kill. Yamaza. Kill the poor, the farmer.
And he's also the guy that went on American television, and then when the interviewer asked him, don't you see that this is causing tension? Don't you see that it might be interpreted? This guy was very diplomatic. This might be interpreted as a call to violence. He just said, oh, crybabies, crybabies. I think you can even play that clip if you want.
It sounds like a genocidal call.
Cry babies. Cry babies.
I'm not calling for the slaughter of white people, at least for now.
It's actually, if you look at his face during that clip, I think that we should tell you all about it. So there's definitely a lot of support for politicians that actively call for the killing of white people in general and specifically farmers. And that does have, it's impossible that there's no link between these expressions by politicians and the actual murders taking place. With that being said, you can't say that every single murder on a farm is a racially motivated killing, but the existence of such racially motivated killings are, it's blatantly obvious. For example, my grandfather's brother, David de Villiers, was murdered on his farm when I was 17 years old. That would be in 2013. And his killer actually wrote in the blood on his walls, white devil, and then, the words white devil were there and some sign or whatever. But in any case, that is patently, obviously, a hate-motivated killing. If you go and you write on the walls in blood, if you go through all of that, then the other thing is, not all, but many of these farm murders have very gruesome torture involved with them. And not even just farm murders, there was murders in the city with us as well. Like in the city, there was a guy in which house they broke into. He had a young son, a young daughter, and they literally poured boiling hot water in the bathtub and then drowned this. Then there was a little baby, Willem Petzer, whose parents they murdered in front of her. I think she was about 2 years old. And then they grabbed her by the hair and dragged her body through the blood of her parents before they killed her. I was involved in a case in Bronkhorstspruit where the guy was working in his workshop and he had a vice grip, and they tortured him by putting his fingers in this vice grip and crushing them. There was another lady with whom we were involved that they didn't kill her, but they tortured her for hours on end with a clothing iron, by burning her with a clothing iron over and over. And this lady was in her 80s. Sure. And that is actually another thing about these farm murders, is the vast majority of them are elderly people. It might be people who don't have as much security on their farms because, elderly people don't really live in the current age. In their subconscious, they still think it's the 80s or the 70s. And they still think it's okay to have no locks on your door, to sleep with the door open because everything will be fine. They don't understand that there's so much of a danger. And then also their reaction time is not like a young person's. They can't defend themselves. And so yes, as I said, there's a lot of nuance to it, but if you look at the fact that there's so much torture involved, as well as the fact that politicians are actively calling for it, there is a point to saying it's racially motivated.
One of the main reasons that one of the main points of frustration, and this is a large part of what motivated the land expropriation bill, expropriation without compensation, is the idea that the majority of the land is in the hands of white commercial farmers. Now, one of the things that when we were traveling through South Africa the last few days, one of the really interesting things that you were pointing out was saying that there's a smaller and smaller group of commercial farmers in general in South Africa.
Yes.
Because the farms are getting bigger because it's very difficult to compete.
Yes.
Tell me about, on one hand, the idea of the land being stolen by the whites and how much merit there is to that accusation. And on the other, what is the impact, A, of farm attacks and B, of the free market in general on farmers as a whole?
So let's make this a little bit broader. I think that the messaging that politicians use is to create envy in order to get votes.
Sure.
And this is a universal concept. I've done a lot of research on election campaigning, and I've found that the data has proven that the more negative your messaging is, the better the outcome, the better motivated people are out to vote. So politicians focus on negativity. We've seen this with Trump and Harris. The biggest point that is now going viral on social media is that thing about they're eating your cats and they're eating your dogs, which is more from the right.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets.
Then from the left wing, the biggest emotion or negative emotion that they create is envy. And this is all over the West. If you go to England, if you go to France, you'll see that politicians are saying to these migrants or even multi-generational people who are not European descent that everyone is racist and that is why you are poor, we will fix that. And they create this envy, and this envy creates hate. And I think that is the core source of the problem is actually democratic parties competing for votes and creating negative emotions within the populace, and they do not really realize what the effect of these negative emotions are, especially if you continuously repeat this message. The more envious and hateful these people become, the more likely they are to actually commit offenses beyond just hateful messaging out there. To get back to the second part of your question about farmers versus just the free market, so there are about 50 farmers murdered roughly per year. I think it became a little bit less in recent years, especially after COVID. After the lockdown, the numbers went down and it didn't come up again. Now, if you look at the actual numbers, there are a lot more than 50 farmers that stop farming per year. We're looking at about 1,000. You can attribute this in part to the free market, because obviously bigger guys buy out smaller guys because it's just the economy of scale. They do have more cash to do it, and they do better with farming, as well as the fact that there is not much government support for agriculture at all in South Africa. And if you look all over the world, I said this before, agriculture is the only industry that you can't really have pure capitalism in. It's just because land is so expensive that it is impossible for you to, as an entrepreneur, buy that land, start farming, and actually make back a return on investment that is in any way even comparable to any other investment. For instance, if you spend 100 million rands in farming, which would be roughly the minimum you have to spend, 100 million, that's about $5 million, in order to set up an operation in agriculture that is sufficient, self-sufficient, that you can actually start making money. You would make maybe pure profit, you would maybe make 1.2 million rands a year, which is exactly 1.2% return on investment. So that's how bad the business of agriculture is. And that is why throughout the West, Europe, America, wherever, it doesn't matter how capitalist that country is in their ideology as a government, like America, for example, farming always gets subsidies from the government.
Sure, and Europe as well, very heavily.
Yes, heavily. But I
very
mean,
heavily subsidized farming.
Europe is a more socialist. European countries are more socialist in general, but America is very capitalist, and still they give these subsidies to farming, because they know that agriculture is basically impossible without government support. And South Africa is actually the country that gets some of the least support from government for agriculture. And I was actually spoken to many farmers. We have quite a big bond with Georgia, and we, after communism...
Georgia the country, not
Georgia
the
the country. They came to us and asked them to help them set up the agricultural sector after communism. The farmers in Georgia couldn't believe their eyes when they saw what the farmers were capable of producing here with zero government support. So we do have some of the best farmers in the world. I'm not trying to be arrogant by saying it. I'm very proud of this fact, but other countries that come to us for help, that ask us to to help build the agricultural sectors have mentioned this. They couldn't believe how it was possible to do that. Getting back to the previous point that we were talking about the envy that governments create, I want to just mention something else about this, and I want to give a shout out to a guy that I follow on Twitter, Will Tanner. He made a great thread about anarcho-tyranny, which is a concept that I've been talking about for the past 8 years. And I've seen that the response of the state in South Africa, as I mentioned at the beginning of this interview, towards people who actually start standing up for themselves, defending themselves, using lethal force, and then even go on protests, is to rather calm down hard on the law-abiding citizens that just get tired of the conditions they live in, and not calm down hard on the criminals. And this concept has been as such in South Africa for the past 20 years, but we start to see that happening in the West. On that thread that I mentioned, I saw a post about an American rancher in Texas who shot some drug dealers on his farm. He was prosecuted for 3 years before he was acquitted. He basically spent his entire net worth on his legal fees, and now he's been acquitted. He has been found not guilty, but it completely destroyed his entire life. And we see the same thing happening in Britain. We know there were quite a few people that were arrested, prosecuted, and found guilty in the span of weeks for tweets that they made on Twitter. And the one person, I believe, got jail time of 2 years just for saying things against the crisis, the migrant crisis, on Twitter. And that is a pure example of what anarcho-tyranny is the fact that the state come down hard on those that are dissident, that speak out against injustices, just to keep the population under control, because the government knows that if the population as a whole starts to stand up, the democracy is finished. And this process might in the short term slow down the resistance against these governments, but in a long time it creates much more animosity amongst the silent majority or the general populace. So it's a short-term solution, but desperate times call for desperate measures. We've seen that desperate measures in South Africa, and we are definitely starting to see them in the West now as well.
One of the very interesting things I find about South Africa is the outsourcing of services that are usually provided by the state.
Oh, yes.
So in the sense of obviously security, you see it everywhere when you drive down. You see barbed wire, cameras, gates, further gates within the compound, and private security companies patrolling the streets. And then you get obviously the closed compounds and closed entire neighborhoods that have been essentially surrounded by walls and
electric
fences and
cameras,
gates.
all of that.
Can you tell me about life in South Africa for the people who've been priced out of that?
So the concept you just described is well documented within academia, and the academic term for this is a parallel state. So on the one hand, you have a dysfunctional government, and on the other hand, you have the private sector essentially building a parallel state within the state. What this means is that because government functions are so dysfunctional, and of course we know that if you look at the hierarchy of government services, protecting its citizens against outside threats via the military or threats inside the country via a police force is on the top of that list. This is the first and main function of government. Even in that, the South African government has failed so desperately that they have created the conditions in which it becomes necessary for the private sector and just for individuals out there to say, but we need to do something about this ourselves. And that's why private security is such a booming sector in South Africa. We have about 480,000 active employed private security guards, which is roughly about twice the size of the entire military and police force in South Africa combined.
Wow. That is wild.
And that's just because out of necessity, because we know that the police is not able to do their work, essentially. They are not able, they are not willing, and they are probably too corrupt to do it. South Africa has one of the most corrupt police forces in the world. Bribery is probably the order of the day amongst the police, yeah. You and I actually went up into Africa, and we saw that the only way that you can actually just have a normal functional trip into Africa is by bribing every second police officer.
Yeah, we had a stack
Otherwise,
of
they
cash
just
designated for that. Part of the budget of the trip was we budgeted corruption into the journey.
Exactly, because if you do not bribe, they are just going to harass you until you just give up. It's extortion,
which they did in Zambia.
In Zambia,
in
yes.
Lusaka, we were stopped.
They arrested us for nothing and
shook us down.
And shook us down basically until we paid them the bribe money that they wanted.
It was all very pleasant. I mean, it wasn't.
Yeah,
they weren't exactly. They were very cheerful about the bribery. They weren't. You know, it was a. They knew they were playing a game, and we were playing the game along with them, and everyone knew what was going on.
So the difference between European corruption and African corruption is that in Europe, when you pay a bribe to an official for that official to do something illegal for you.
Sure.
In Africa, you pay a bribe just to get him to do his job.
I think one of the interesting differences is in Africa, corruption is more available to the everyday man.
Yes.
Whereas in Europe, I mean, if you look at something like Qatargate, where the Moroccans and the Qataris were busy bribing the deputy president of the European Council, Eva Kaili, a socialist member of the European Parliament from Greece, you know, the stacks of cash were so big that one of the officials bribed, got a suitcase, I believe it was a suitcase filled with 50,000 euros that he dumped because he didn't know what to do with the cash. That's how much money was being poured into the European Parliament. And they were sending in literal amendments via text messages to members of the European Parliament saying, hey, can you amend this bill? Can you include this? And preparing their texts for them. It was extraordinary. But that level, and then on the other hand, in Europe, the idea of bribing a police officer is I mean, unheard of. This is a phenomenon that has not been seen, certainly not in my lifetime. I don't believe in my parents' lifetime either, and I definitely...
Well, definitely in your parents' lifetime. It happened under communism.
In communism it happened, sure. I was talking about, you know, the other side.
Western Europe, okay. I thought you were talking about Poland.
In Poland, it's a very interesting case. We have completely eradicated corruption from the police force. The crackdown on crime in the 90s was, the moment the Iron Curtain fell, the moment communism ended, the crackdown was severe. We had a group of organized criminals who took advantage of the lawlessness of the 90s and the general chaos of, you know, transitioning from a command economy to a free market. And we had very serious problems with organized crime. But the crackdown was so strong and so powerful that you know, organized crime, I mean, Warsaw is today one of the very safest cities in Europe, by far. I mean, the murder rate is close to zero. The rape rate is close to zero. I mean, you can walk around at night, you know, in a miniskirt and you'll be absolutely fine.
That's very, very good.
It
is a good thing.
But going back to South Africa, what are some of the... I mean, South Africa's reappeared. As I mentioned, there was that moment around 2015, 2016, when a large number of journalists came in, including myself, to document what was happening, try and find out what was happening. And that kind of, you know, many of them warned about an oncoming civil war. I think that was a recurring theme. Many of the farmers then, I think a lot of people were very jittery. And none of that has come to fruition. Sure, the murders have continued, the farm attacks have continued, the general insecurity of the country has probably gotten worse, but you can still operate, you can still run a business. Here we are sitting in a podcast studio. Everything works, right? We drove down roads that worked. The toll gates work. The toll gates work very well. They take your money. And yet, you know, South Africa's reappearing in the discourse again with this concept of South Africanization. Yeah. And it's reappeared in the context mostly of mass migration in the West, the shifting demographics, and we're seeing this happen very rapidly. The capital city of the United Kingdom is no longer majority white British.
Of course.
And, you know, this is a very serious shift that has been accelerating in the last few years. It accelerated with Merkel's Weltschaffen das of welcome. 1 in 20 Syrians today lives in Germany. That is an extraordinary statistic. We still have, the floodgates are still open. NGOs are sailing into or sailing into Libyan waters and picking up migrants from human traffickers. The flow of migrants still continues through the Balkans, with Erdogan opening the floodgates into Europe, and we're seeing the dinghies arrive in Calais on a daily basis. And the demographics of Europe and of America, where we've seen the crisis at the southern border, are drastically shifting. And what does that mean? What does South Africanization, how would you define that? You know, it's a term that's sort of entering, maybe not the mainstream yet, but it's certainly appearing in many places.
When I look at politics, following social media and following trends in the West, which I do enjoy to do quite a lot, I see the West being roughly a generation behind South Africa. What I mean by that is, amongst the white populace in South Africa during the 90s, you had a lot of liberalism, you had a lot of people who were pragmatic and said, we're going to make this work, we're going to help. And a lot of people who thought, you know, reparations, black economic empowerment, as they call it, positive discrimination, it was widely supported amongst white people. They thought, you know what, that's fair. To be fair, you guys are much worse off than we are. To be fair, you know, it was an unfair system, so let's try and fix that, and let's put that into law in our constitution. It even says that discrimination on grounds of race or sex or whatever is unacceptable unless it's positive discrimination in order to restore, you know, the dignity, the injustice of the past. So sure. The academic term we use for this is restorative justice. Sure. Now, restorative justice had been written into law because the populace supported it in the 90s. And what I see in the West right now, in Europe and in America, the young people of today are very much pro-restorative justice, just like the young people in South Africa were during the 90s. And my fear for the West is that they are going to make the exact same mistake that we made in South Africa and write restorative justice into law as deep as we did, even into our constitution. And what we saw with this concept of restorative justice, it's like trying to uplift communities that are previously disadvantaged, but instead of uplifting them...
Or discriminated, in this case.
Yes. Instead of uplifting them and then gradually lessen the discrimination, or as they call it, the positive discrimination over time, because we know that black economic empowerment was originally meant to be ended in 2012. But the exact opposite happened, Stefan. What happened here was these measures of what they called restorative justice was just increased by the year. Every single year we have more and more and more racial laws. There's actually an interesting graph that I can send to you by the Free Market Foundation, where they show that there are now roughly 6 times more racial laws in South Africa than there were during apartheid. So the broader concept I want to explain is basically just that within the broader ideology of restorative justice, it will become much and much and much and much worse over time. It won't lessen over time as the original idea was. Getting back to the West, the young people within the West do support the exact same ideology. When I did my law degree, we did this in very much detail, and while reading through the textbooks of constitutional court cases that we had in the 90s, the rhetoric used there were exactly the same as the rhetoric used by left-wing parties in Europe and in America right now today. And the similarities are so obvious that one can almost say it's blatantly obvious that the West is going down the exact same path as South Africa. They are just one generation behind it. I really fear for what's happening in the West if they also employ this type of strategies within their law, and the demographic shift becomes so radical that they also become minorities in their own countries. Then they're in for a bad time. Then you guys will come to us and ask us, how did we survive this?
Obviously, the difference, and I think this is an important difference, is that South Africa is a country in Africa. The whites are obviously not indigenous to this land. You consider yourself an African. And yet, here you are, a white man in a majority black country. What is the racial demographic of South Africa? And are whites truly indigenous to here? Are you an African? And to what extent can this example of South Africa be used in the context of what's happening in the West? Because of that element that I mentioned of
Stefan,
not being indigenous.
I'm gonna speak directly to that element, and that is envy is envy. And the arguments you made were very logical. I mean, for a thinking person, you can't really logically debate against these arguments. In Europe, Europeans are indigenous.
Sure.
But the problem with that is that feelings don't care about your facts. I mean, the rhetoric used by black nationalists and communists in South Africa is exactly the same as the rhetoric used in France, in Germany, in England, and in America. It doesn't matter what the historical context is, because envy is envy, and they will always, if you allow it, these ideologues will always tell you that these people have been treated unfairly, and therefore you must pay for them to restore the balance. In other words, if we look at what's happening in England right now, if we look at what's happening all over Europe right now, the rhetoric used within this ideology is so similar to what had been used in South Africa that I can safely make the statement that the historical context just doesn't matter. Because envy is envy, and because of this envy, they will always want what is yours. If you have more than them, they will always want what is yours, and therefore it is very easy for radical ideologues to place this idea within their minds that you owe them. Historical context doesn't matter, Stefan.
To what extent is South Africa run by, how left-wing are the powers that be that have been running South Africa since apartheid ended?
If you look at the ANC of the 90s, where Mandela was basically the figurehead and the man behind the ANC running the show was Joe Slovo. Now, Joe Slovo was a radical communist. That guy believed in communism as if it was the gospel. But the ANC and the South African Communist Party are actually a coalition that ran this country from 1994. And in name, they call themselves communists, just like the USSR. But the difference between us and the USSR, and this is actually something I'm very positive about, I always say to people, I would much rather be oppressed by a communist like Cyril Ramaphosa than a communist like Joseph Stalin.
Oh, for sure.
And the reason for this is because they are so incompetent, they are unable to actually implement real communism here. Even if their ideology is completely communistic, we are not a communistic country, not because they don't want to be communist, just because they are too incompetent to implement communism in South Africa. So, how I always describe this, as I said, we have a parallel state, we have two countries in one. We have very high taxation, we have free healthcare, for example, but the free healthcare is so bad it just doesn't work. It's impossible. They give millions and millions and millions, even billions of rands, many billions of rands actually, to the South African healthcare system, and the healthcare system doesn't improve at all because the management of the system is just so bad that the money basically just gets gobbled up and nothing is done with it. That's just one example. We have many state functions that are just completely dysfunctional to the extent where the private sector was forced to take over these functions. Now what happened here is that the general populace who can't afford to pay for private services that replace these state services, they basically get no services at all. While the private sector is run completely on its own in a parallel state where we have this phenomenon where we basically have two countries in one. I've heard the term being used that South Africa is a first world country existing within a third world country. And that is completely true. If you drive out here and you see it looks like a first world country. But that is why the private sector almost completely took over the functions of the state. For example, those farms that we were on last week, you saw how nicely those roads were maintained. Why? Because the farmers are doing it themselves. They are paying for the company that does it. All of it is done privately because the state just won't ever fix the roads.
Sure.
And this in turn creates a vicious cycle because it creates more and more and more envy amongst those who do not have, because the haves are improving their lives via the private sector, continuously bettering their conditions.
While the converse is true for those who have nothing.
Yes, while
they will have even less than they had.
Their conditions are deteriorating very fast. I mean, if you just look at the price of food in South Africa after COVID, it quadrupled. Now, these guys that basically lived from hand to mouth, their entire salary went into food. Before COVID even, they live in a tin shack, which they don't pay anything for. They just stay on the land, they don't rent anything, they build themselves a little tin shack. They go to work, they get paid minimum wage, and minimum wage is basically enough to keep them alive, paying for their transport to work and buying food. And this was the case before COVID. Now, with the food prices that quadrupled, they can't even afford food anymore. They're going hungry. I mean, their conditions have deteriorated so much, whilst the people who have something and who are working towards building something for themselves via the private sector, their lives are continuously improving. And do you have any idea the resentment that this causes under those that do not have? So that's why I'm saying I have empathy. I completely understand where they're coming from, because if I was living under those conditions, I would also be envious, and I would also be really angry. And the problem is that they do not direct their anger against the people who actually destroyed their lives. They direct it against white people, because the people who are actively destroying their livelihoods are continuously telling them it's the white man's fault. And this is also happening in Europe. This is why I'm saying historical context doesn't matter, because the exact same concept is happening in Europe. Once this guy who has nothing is convinced that it's your fault that he has nothing, and that he's living in poverty, and that his life is so difficult, it doesn't matter what logical argument you bring to him, he will always believe that you're his enemy.
A few years ago, I went to a squatter camp that was occupied by white South Africans, Munsieville, and that was at the time when I went there. It was one of not so many. There was the statistics that I saw at the time was that roughly 400,000 white people were living in poverty in South Africa out of a population roughly of 4 million whites, about 10% of the population. How common is white poverty in South Africa? Is it getting worse? Are these squatter camps getting more numerous?
Actually, no, Stefan. They are getting smaller by the year.
Okay. Why is that?
Well, the reason for that is first because we have a myriad of organizations that are specifically there just to help poor white people. Since the awareness had been raised about the problem of white poverty in South Africa, a whole bunch of people jumped up, started organizations. Some of them steal your money, some of them do excellent work. And
like NGOs everywhere.
Exactly. And those that did excellent work did help these guys raise themselves up from this poverty. On the other hand, there had been a culture shift within white people in South Africa. If you look at the 90s, the vast majority of people that that were in the upper brackets of income, which is roughly in South African terms, if they make about $250 per year or more. 90% of those people that made the equivalent of that during the 90s were working for a salary in a high-level position at some job, which today, because of BEE, is mostly not possible for white people. Today,
there's a large black middle class that has emerged since the end of apartheid.
Today, 95% of the top bracket of white earners are entrepreneurs or self-employed. And that just shows you the cultural shift. It's so difficult for a white person to get a job that white people in South Africa has just said, well, I can't get a job in corporate because the law prevents me from doing it, so I'm just going to start a plumbing company. He starts his plumbing company and is now earning more than the engineer that got the top spot at, whichever company is in South Africa, whether that be Mercedes-Benz or, there are quite a few engineering companies that still operate here. So with that culture shift amongst white South Africans, and because of the fact that entrepreneurship had become so ingrained in our culture, I would say in my generation, the vast majority of guys I went to school with are self-employed. And they are doing very well for themselves. The ones that actually studied to become some sort of professional, like an engineer, even amongst them, I would say at least 30% are self-employed, the other 60% got jobs at the company. And with this culture shift, a lot less people end up in white squatter camps because people have taught themselves how to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. Doesn't matter how hard the conditions are, the culture has changed in such a way, and this is the reason why white squatter camps are shrinking in South Africa.
But so you were telling me about, you know, the incompetence of implementing a communist society. But from what it sounds like, what you're saying is that actually it is possible to be an entrepreneur and to operate a business and to run a business in South Africa. Isn't that slightly contradictory in terms?
No, not if you understand the law. So in the law in South Africa, companies get regulated as soon as they reach a certain number of employees or if they reach a certain amount of income. But if you're an entrepreneur, self-employed, you can stay under that 50 employee mark. And you can stay under, I can't remember the exact number of turnover. Then you are basically unregulated because you're seen as a small business, and only medium businesses start getting regulations. Now, if you're a small business and you become a medium business because you're really successful, you just make your wife a director of a separate business, and your two businesses, two small businesses, except for one medium business. So they all, I mean, when you put in laws to regulate a populace, it's almost impossible that there will be no loopholes, and those loopholes are being found. And this allows people to make a success out of their lives.
What is the advice that you would give as a South African to Europeans and to the West more generally?
Become self-sufficient. Start organizing within your community, make friends with your neighbor, realize that if things go the way that they went in South Africa, and I'm not saying they are, I'm saying the possibility is there and it's looking more likely by the day. If things become like in South Africa, you're going to need to realize that you're going to have to depend on your neighbor and his neighbor to help you become self-sufficient in taking over the crucial services that are not being provided by the state to you. And that is how the South African white population, or the Afrikaner population even more in general, have survived. Becoming self-sufficient. I have to name something that's very interesting. The old South African government's ideology was very socialist. It was very close to Germany. I mean, we are a Germanic people. We are attracted to socialism more than we realize ourselves. We want that system of the state to look after us, and that's what the previous government did. It was, I mean, almost all services were government run, electricity, water, you know, the works. There were almost no privatization, and we had to make that shift in our minds away from that concept of the state providing the services and us just be loyal citizens to the state, towards becoming independent citizens, doing all of these things for ourselves, and thus creating our own small state, our own first world country within this third world country. This might sound a little bit right-wing, but I've got a friend who always says we are a first world people living amongst third world peoples. And we have created a first world country within a third world country. And obviously, if I had to give advice to Europeans, is you should wake up, you should realize what I just said is the truth, and it will be the truth in your country as well. And that is why you really need to start organizing amongst yourselves in order to do what we have achieved over the last 20 years.
Thank you, Willem. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Stefan, for having me.
My pleasure.